It looks like LSAC may have just taken another quiet step toward scoring the writing sample. Of course, there hasn't been any announcement, there's not been any press release, but if you look at your official LSAT score report on lsac.org, there is now a field labeled Writing Ability Score sitting right next to your LSAT score itself. This is an actual field on an official LSAC document. Now, let me say this clearly right away. This does not mean the writing sample is being scored today. It's not being scored if you're taking the LSAT in January, February, April, or June. Nothing is changing overnight, but LSAC adding that field is not random. And when you zoom out and you look at what law schools are dealing with right now, this move actually makes a lot of sense. Now, this is not coming out of nowhere. LSAC wrote a blog post over a year ago saying that the writing sample would remain an unscored part of the LSAT, but over the course of the testing cycle, they are analyzing data of the new argumentative LSAT writing prompt to assess its validity and reliability with a long-term goal of providing a scored LSAT writing sample assessment. On LSAC's website, they also allude to it being scored in the future. They say that currently it is remaining unscored, but they do have the goal of course, scoring it at some point in the future. And admissions offices are pushing for this because they are facing a few problems all at the same time. Of course, application essays can now be heavily written or polished with ChatGPT. There is a lot of LSAT score inflation, and it's getting harder for law schools to tell who is genuinely ready versus who just optimized and is able to game the system. The timed writing sample is the only place where law schools can see how you think and how you write at the same time. Now, the writing ability score suggests that LSAC will provide both a scored portion of the LSAT out of 180, your traditional multiple choice portion, but separately a scored writing sample. Now, there's the question of whether scoring a writing sample is truly subjective, but there are objective ways to measure writing ability, and law schools can use metrics, they can use rubrics, they can look at the length of your essay, the depth of the vocabulary that you're using, the structured nature of your essays, and all of that can provide a quantifiable metric for a score in some way. Now, when LSAC changes the writing sample report, when they change your score report, it's not casually. They're doing it for a purpose. Fields exist because data is expected to show up there at some point. For a couple of years now, LSAC has been analyzing the new argumentative writing format for validity and reliability with the stated long-term goal of scoring it. And so we've got to look at what problem LSAC is trying to solve. Once you answer that, the rest will just fall into place. Now, you could ask, why not add yet another logical reasoning section, or why not tougher proctoring, or why not interviews? All of those would provide more logistical challenges, and some of them would not serve the same purpose, of course. Interviews are a whole additional logistical challenge. Some law schools offer them, some don't. Of course, that is quite labor intensive, but the writing sample already exists, and it's already part of the LSAT. It doesn't immediately mess with ABA reporting, and it's relatively cheap to scale. I could even imagine, ironically, law schools pushing LSAC to score the writing sample in response to AI-generated essays, and then LSAC using AI to score these human-written essays. Kind of ironic, but that's not a reason that law schools and LSAC wouldn't do it anyway. From LSAC's point of view, scoring the writing sample could be the lowest friction way to strengthen the validity of the LSAT without redesigning the exam from scratch. Now, LSAC will be the ones to ultimately decide whether and when the writing sample gets scored, but law schools will be the ones who decide how much it ultimately matters. Those are two different decisions. Even if the writing sample becomes scored, it won't suddenly become as important as your LSAT score out of 180 or your GPA. Any new metric at first is just additional context, not going to be a deal maker or a deal breaker. It's additional helpful context, but it's not going to be the ultimate decider. Now, a lot of people will say that law schools won't care. It'll exist, but nobody's going to use the writing sample. But that's not really how admissions works. Schools don't need to care loudly with big announcements for something to matter quietly on the sidelines. A scored writing sample would probably be used in a couple of different ways at the start. First, it could serve as a sort of check or a red flag check. So if your personal statement sounds off and your writing sample sounds totally different, they're definitely going to notice. If you have a really high LSAT score out of 180, but you can't write clearly under time pressure, they're going to notice. And it could also be used as a tiebreaker because when scores cluster, when there's a lot of score inflation, schools end up with a lot of applicants who look basically the same, similar GPAs, similar LSAT scores, comparable resumes. And so in those cases, you demonstrating your ability to write clearly under pressure could tip the scales in your favor. And then, of course, there's scholarships, because when an application looks really polished, maybe even too polished, schools are going to want an additional measure of confidence that you can actually perform independently without anybody else helping you. And you showing your ability to write well under pressure is going to help answer that question. Now, there's this natural worry that people have when they hear about a new metric, which is this just another thing I've got to max out? Is there a way to game this system? But this is very unlikely to become another arms race like the scored portions of the LSAT currently, because unlike LSAT multiple choice scores, writing assessments will not naturally spread people out cleanly from top to bottom from 180 to 120 along the spectrum. And that's going to limit how much weight the writing sample can realistically carry. We don't know that people's writing ability is distributed along a curve like LSAT scores will be. And schools are not trying to rank applicants from the best writer to the worst writer. They're asking a much simpler question, which is, does the writing make sense given the rest of the file? Meaning, does your application essay, your personal statement, does it match the quality of your writing sample, or is it suspect? Is it possible or likely that you are not the person who wrote your application essays? They're looking, in other words, for consistency. Then the other thing to know is that writing is hard to artificially optimize at scale, because you can't meaningfully game a live timed writing sample the same way that you can polish your essays over weeks using fancy admissions consultants or using AI. And you can't retake the LSAT, or the same way that you can't retake the LSAT multiple times. In other words, you can polish your essays, you can retake the LSAT several times, but the writing sample is going to be what it is, and law schools will be able to see it. And law schools don't really have any reason to turn this into a new cutoff, because they already have your LSAT score and your GPA for that. Those are the factors that drive rankings, they drive medians, and writing is not going to replace those. It sits underneath them as an additional check, but not a primary metric. So writing functions more like a stabilizer and a consistency check to flag mismatches rather than another metric that you have to perfect. And of course, if writing does become scored, which it probably will this year or next year, if I had to guess, I'd say more likely this year, starting in August or September. Because of the LSAT cheating scandals, law schools are pushing for a metric that cannot be gamed, the way the LSAT is getting kind of ruined in a way between score inflation and the cheating scandal with the cheating rings in mainland China. So the writing assessments will be messy at first, and law schools are going to know that, but it's more reason for this to get pushed going forward. Now, the writing sample will matter more if your essays were heavily edited or AI assisted, and your LSAT score, if it's a big outlier compared to your academic record, it's going to matter more. It's going to matter less if you're applying right now, or if your writing has been consistent, and if your LSAT and GPA already tell a pretty clear story. Now, one factor I wanted to talk about is the question of retakes and score validity, how those will be impacted by scoring the writing sample. So if the writing sample is scored in the near future, which I expect it will be, a lot of people are wondering, if this will affect your existing LSAT score, or if you could be forced to retake later. So I want to be clear. LSAC will not retroactively invalidate scores that were valid under the rules when you took the test. And so if you took the LSAT under a set of published terms, those terms still apply to your score. In other words, if you want to knock out the LSAT before they score the writing sample, you could take the LSAT now, lock in your score. It's good for 5 years. And then later, if they score the writing sample, you won't need to retake it. You're going to be set. In other words, if they score the writing sample, it will apply for future test takers, but not for those who took it in the past. So new test takers will likely have a scored writing requirement, possibly in the second half of this year, if not a year from now. And for a while, both versions will exist side by side, meaning some folks will be applying to law school with an unscored writing, some will apply with a scored writing during that transitional period. We saw LSAC do this in the past. Some folks applied to law school with logic games LSAT scores, and some after logic games were removed. Law schools don't really care which version of the test you took. It's all the same to them. They're not going to penalize you for it. Now, when people hear scored writing, they imagine law schools looking for something fancy, and they're not. They're not looking for beautiful prose or creativity. They're not looking for big words that are used just to sound impressive. What they want is much simpler and much more practical. They want to see that you can take a position, support it logically, acknowledge the other side, and communicate clearly under pressure. That is it. They're asking one basic question. If we put this person in a classroom, on a cold call, or on a timed exam, can they think clearly and explain themselves? So good writing in this context means your position is obvious, your reasoning is easy to follow, your paragraphs don't wander, and your writing is consistent from start to finish. Now, bad writing isn't about grammar mistakes or awkward sentences. Bad writing is when the reader can't tell what you're arguing, why you're arguing it, or whether you actually believe it. From a school's perspective, the writing sample is not about ranking applicants by literary skill. It's about giving schools the confidence that the person who shows up is the same person they admitted that you are the person who wrote your application essays. Now, to do well on the writing sample, whether scored or not, you don't need to become a great writer. You just got to look like someone who can think clearly and argue coherently under time pressure. If and when the writing becomes scored, it's going to reward clear reasoning, not fancy language. So stick to a simple structure, state your position, give a couple of reasons for it, acknowledge the other side, and then wrap it up with a concise conclusion. If you can't explain your position in one sentence, you probably don't really have a very clear position. So just pick one side, stick with it, and use the evidence deliberately. And writing under live conditions is actually to your advantage because you're going to have clear, simple prose with no need to edit heavily, no need to use AI. And if you can outline things cleanly in advance, it's going to make the writing a whole lot easier. Now, some thoughts on what not to do. Don't try to sound smart. Don't use fancy words that you don't know what they mean. Don't hedge, and don't ignore the counter arguments, and don't over-prepare for the writing at the expense of logical reasoning or reading comp. Because even if and when writing becomes scored, logical reasoning and reading comp still drive the outcomes and matter a lot more. And so, bottom line, even though we now have this writing ability score field on your score report, that doesn't mean that scoring starts tomorrow, but it does suggest LSAC is building towards scoring the writing sample, and it gives us more reason to think that they will start scoring it, even possibly in the second half of 2026. So start treating the writing sample like it could matter more soon, use one repeatable structure, and practice enough so that your writing ability under time pressure is fluent.